For me personally, the most tragic, most unfortunate aspect of our diaspora relationship to those people in Ukraine is that most of our Ukrainian Catholics and Ukrainian Orthodox would be incapable of following along in singing or understanding or having any appreciation for the chants and the religious hymnography and the prayers that were being sung and read hour after hour on the Maidan. Pointed question for Father Andriy Chirovsky, yes.
So, to my esteemed colleague to the left, Father Cyril Hovorun, just like Mr. Weigel, I really enjoyed your presentation, and I think you hit the nail on the head. What I want to ask is, why do you think that some people get the difference between a church-state approach and a church-civil society approach, and some people don't get it? Because, I mean, they went through this experience together, right? Why did some people get it, but some people just don't seem to understand? Could you help us understand that?
Yes, wonderful question. Well, I just started thinking, do I get the difference myself? Well, actually, it's a new thing, relatively new thing, that society is considered as a subject distant from the state. I think it appears for the first time in Hegel in the beginning of the 19th century, so it's really a new thing. Which means it's a thing which belongs to modernity. It's a feature of modern thinking, not postmodern thinking, but modern thinking, which was transferred to the postmodern thinking as well. So if you don't really digest modernity, you don't consider this kind of difference important. If you are stuck to the holy past, you don't really appreciate this kind of difference, I think. Sometimes we take our traditions, especially the traditions of the church-state relationship, as a part of the big tradition with capital T. And this is a mistake. I think this is a very serious mistake. The same mistake, to my understanding, occurs also in other traditions. I think it took quite a long time for the Roman Catholic Church to digest the American democracy. And it did not happen until Vatican II, and still there are some struggles, I think. In this regard, we need to, or if you take the evangelical churches in the United States, still, why Putin is so much popular among them? Surprisingly, I was really astonished how much popular is that person. You see that, well, and I completely concur with George's presentation. It needs struggle. It needs all the time effort, to apply effort to sustain this republicanism, or not republicanism in the American sense necessarily, but in the sense of political science, democracy, the self-reliance of people. You need always to apply effort. And for the churches, it is always necessary to apply effort to appropriate this, to comply with this, and to enrich this. If the churches just tolerate democracy, democracy suffers, not to say about the churches. But democracy can be enriched only when the church enrich democracy in a creative way. And this is possible, I think, only when the church realizes the distinctiveness of the society. It's not the whole thing, but it's a condition sine qua non, so to say. So it requires struggle. It requires common sense, at least, on behalf of the churches, and then it also requires a wise attitude to the traditions of the church.
Father Cyril, basically your notion was that though you say you like it and you understand historically, but the symphony of the church and state, basically you see it as something negative or outdated or something that, now, there's a nuance here, I think, in that, I mean, we see this, there's a struggle now to form a new Ukrainian state, the civil society is very active, and there's creep, sort of crawl back, creep back, but there was a revolution, and there was a sea change, and we have a new Ukraine, and the state is becoming much more of the people, by the people, for the people. So it's not necessary that the state is a adversary for the church or for churches. I mean, it is actually part of the society, and so there's a nuance that it can be a partner still, and not necessarily in a negative way. And one thing footnote, Ahmed Tamim, the leader of the large all Ukrainian Muslim clerical association, during the Yanukovych years, I know from inside information that he was felt very much sidelined, no longer, invited, no longer, and he was very happy. Again, I'm not going to judge this, but he was very happy when, after the revolution, when Turchinov would come to their religious occasions, and he was again in some sort of symphony with the state.
Yeah, I should say that symphony, again, that symphony should be understood from different perspectives in our discussion. Symphony as a historical pattern of relationship between the church and the state, as emerged from the writings of Eusebius of Caesarea, and then confirmed by Justinian, by the Codex Civilis of the Byzantine Empire, is one thing. And symphony as another thing, as a harmonic way of coexistence of the church and the state, probably is a different thing. Well, in this broader sense, symphony is something that needs to be achieved, certainly. Symphony as a harmony, as coherence between the church and the state. Well, my criticism of symphony does not address the church-state relationship as such, per se. My point is that the historical forms of the church-state relationship were often abusive. And if they are imported to our days on the premise that they are traditional, they are a part of the Byzantine tradition or whatever, they could be really harmful. So certainly, partnership between the church and the state should be appreciated, should be encouraged. But the way how we see this partnership should be different, should be really stemming from our understanding of democracy and our understanding of the civil society.
I mean, just that. So, symphony is a technical term from the way that the Byzantine Empire related to the church. So when Father used that, he was using that as a technical term, but I think many of us just thought we're using it as a metaphor. No, it's a technical, legal understanding of how the church and the state relate to each other. That's what the criticism was towards, not towards the metaphor of harmonious coexistence.
Can I just throw something in here? I think there are dangers on both sides of this. The symphonia in the technical sense, the risk there is that the church becomes the chaplain to the state. And inevitably ends up blessing whatever the state does. This American phrase, separation of church and state, can be misinterpreted to mean the exclusion of not simply religious institutions from a direct political role, but the exclusion of religiously grounded moral argument from public life, what my colleague and dear friend Richard John Newhouse called the naked public square. So, and that's the danger on that end, and the Symphonia is chaplain to the Tsar, whatever form the Tsar happens to be taking at the moment. I don't think there is any divinely mandated answer to I mean, this is one the Lord left us to sort out in the contingencies of history. And it's important in an evolving situation like Ukraine, which has understood, I think, the danger on the Symphonia side, to understand the danger on the separation side, and not to allow George Soros or somebody like that to roll into Ukraine and proclaim the necessity of the naked public square for any sort of democratic future.
Yeah, just I'd like to add a sort of a historical angle to that question, and to ask Father Kirill whether we know any sort of ideal symphonia model in history of the balance coexistence between church and state, at least in its Byzantine embodiment. Because it seems like the negative connotation of the Byzantine form of symphonia is the church is always subservient to the state. And we have two partners, but one is more equal than the other, as it were. So do we have any historical examples of the more balanced approach in symphonia?
Yeah. Well, actually, symphony was always an ideal. Symphony was something as it was invented by German idealists. It was very much like that, German idealism of the Byzantine time. It means that it never happened in reality. Well, as with German idealism, it led to some horrible historical forms of incarnation of this ideal, somehow the way from Kant to Krupp, so to say. So in Byzantium, it was also not infrequently that these ideals of symphony led to abuses, to horrible abuses. I don't find any ideal, any incarnation of the ideal of symphony in Byzantium from the historical perspective, which would really please me personally, say no. And I think it is important because it means that no one model of relationship between the church and the state could be taken, perceived as ideal, as in full symphony according with the gospel. There are no biblical buttons of the church-state relationship. They don't exist. And they are impossible, I would say. It means it is always a challenge for the church to develop a way of relationship with the state which would best serve the church's understanding of the gospel. It means again that the church gets trained in gospel by exercising its relationship with the state all the time. The church always has to solve difficult dilemmas in relationship with the state, regardless of what kind of state. Is it monarchy or theocracy or liberal democracy or whatever? It's always a challenge for the church. And at every stage, at every time, the church has to solve this problem. And this solution is always temporarily.
I just want a question to George, Mr. Professor Weigel. I think you've identified a very good topic and concern, and it is critical, the crisis of civilizational morale in your book. And I'd like you to address other factors that are causing that, because you identify some in your book and you identify some solutions like virtue ethics. However, the whole area of postmodern reality and virtual reality is something that the church doesn't specifically address. Maybe you're aware of how or whether it does address it, and what you think of that particular issue. because I think that that is a critical issue. It is an extension of skepticism throughout history, and I think that it's generally outlined in Faith and Reason. But I think the Vatican hasn't targeted that particular problem, and that is a serious problem because our civilization needs to be stronger. If other civilizations are going to be emulating it, and that's, I mean, if Ukraine and the other people that want to join Europe, are actually going to be attracted to it, that problem has to be resolved.
What Bogdan is referring to is a little book I published 8 years ago now, 9 years ago, called The Cube in the Cathedral. And it was an attempt to explain what a lot of political science types were arguing about at the time, the sort of European malaise. And I tried to explain it in cultural and moral and religious and indeed civilizational terms. I think the problem of civilizational morale, a confidence in the rightness of the goodness of the civilizational project of which one is a part, has only gotten worse in Europe over the past 9 years. When people tell me, well, I of all your books, I really like The Cube in the Cathedral best, my constant response is, that's the one I really wish I had gotten wrong. But I don't think I did. I mean, I think the de-Christianization, or more broadly, the collapse of a biblical view of the human condition in Europe, which has been going on for several hundred years, is at the bottom of the catastrophes of the mid-20th century in Europe. 2 world wars, 3 totalitarian systems, Gulag, Auschwitz, all of it. And Europe has simply not recovered from that. There was a burst of philoprogenitive energy after the Second World War, but the deeper cultural malaise simply accelerated from 1968 on. This has now reached a point of complete insanity in some forms of postmodernism. I think of Derrida after 9/11 saying, we do not know what this phrase 9/11 means. Well, Jacques, come on over to New York or come to Washington, we'll show you what it means. This is complete craziness. It's subjectivism run riot. Now, I think the church has addressed this. The last great teaching document of John Paul II in the sphere of social ethics was the 2003 apostolic letter, Ecclesia in Europa, the Church in Europe, which completed, actually it was an apostolic exhortation, it completed the work of a synod on the future of the church in Europe held before the Great Jubilee of 2000. And you can actually treat it, to go back to Father Andrey's presentation, as the Pope's report card to Europe on Centesi Lozano's 12 years later. And it's basically D-. And it was reading that letter which emphasizes the demographic winter into which Europe is consciously putting itself as perhaps the single biggest expression of the phrase I use, the crisis of civilizational morale. This is the first time in human history when an entire continent, wealthier, healthier, more secure than ever before, has declined to create the human future in the most elementary sense of creating the human future, having children. That's going on in Europe today, systematic, willful depopulation. I mean, there have been depopulations before, but there's been war, famine, plague, whatever. This is willful. And I think it expresses that lack of the biblical vision. I'm talking too long. Let me just put this very, very quickly. What I mean by the West, and the West in both its lungs, East and West, is the happy product of the interaction of Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome. Biblical religion, which teaches us that life is pilgrimage. Greek rationality, which teaches us that there are truths in the world and us, that we can know them. And the Roman idea that the rule of law is superior to the rule of brute force. You put those together in the cocktail shaker and you get the civilization of the West. Or to take a different image, there are three legs on the stool. Europe kicked the leg marked Jerusalem out in the 19th century with the emergence of what Andrey de Lubac called atheistic humanism. The God of the Bible is the enemy of human maturation. Turns out when you kick the Jerusalem leg out of the stool, the Athens leg gets wobbly. Because if reason is not informed by a sense of the logos, the divine reason implanted in the world, then reason gets wobbly, and when that leg collapses, we know, the Roman leg, law, you get what Benedict XVI called the dictatorship of relativism. John Paul II addressed this at some length. Benedict XVI addresses in the Bundestag, at Westminster Hall in London, at Regensburg, and where was the fourth one? Oh, at the UN, are all attempts to try to remind the West that it's not just a question of the machinery of democracy or the machinery of the EU alone. And very few people seem to be listening. And that is very dangerous.
What are the implications for the internal organization of the churches of that kind of movement, of the ecclesiology, the relationship between the bishops, lay people?
It's a question of understanding society as such. I think if you were to ask, Durkheim or Weber, the great sociologists, about these issues, they would say, there's Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, and the church has always understood itself as something that is both a community, a communion, and also something that interacts, a communion that is divine, and something that interacts with all of a human community, society. And as it was said before, this is a constant challenge to work out. There's no, just as in church-state relations, church-civil society relations are things to be constantly worked out, because these are living questions that require living responses that are dynamic and are self-adjusting. And the church, whether we're talking about the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church, have sometimes acted like they had the answers, right? And so sometimes in their pronouncements, they make it seem like, oh, we knew all this stuff all along. But really, it's something that we improvise based on more foundational notions, which, George outlined the non-negotiables, but how we exactly work it out is a work in progress. If we were to take the solution from 100 years ago and try to apply it today, it would fall flat. And we don't know how society is morphing in the decades to come, for us to try to come up with some kind of structure that the church could somehow impose Deus ex machina on society. It's we're in the world, but not of the world, and that relationship leaves a big question mark for us to constantly try to respond to. I think, I don't know, perhaps one of the other panelists has something.
If I just could add to that, that I see a direct interconnection between the development of the civil society and ecclesiology. I think they mutually affect each other. If you consider the developments in the church and in the society in the 19th century, with the growing importance of the people voices, with republicanism growing in the Balkan countries, for instance, you see that the similar processes occurred in the church. When the role of laity became increasingly important in those churches, with the new councils composed now not of the hierarchy but also of lay people started taking place. The so-called clergy-like councils, and the importance of community was stressed simultaneously with the growing of the society. And I think the same happens today. The appropriation by the church of the values of the civil society helps the church to re-evaluate its own structures, to pay more attention to its own communities. Communities become more important when society gets aware, when the church gets aware of the society. So these things are really connected to each other.
Let me take a cut at that from a slightly different angle, because I heard the question a bit differently. It seems to me that in the 21st century, we're not simply talking about the political disestablishment of the church, meaning a much more informal legal relationship, a constitutional relationship. We're also talking about the cultural disestablishment of the church. One can no longer count throughout the Western world as far as the eastern borders of Ukraine, I would say, on the faith being transmitted by the cultural air we breathe. On the contrary, the cultural air we breathe is actively hostile to biblical religion. This means that whatever set of legal arrangements we find ourselves in vis-a-vis the state, that the Christian project has to rediscover its evangelical or missionary origins, because that's the only way the faith is going to be transmitted, by actively proposing friendship with Jesus Christ is the answer to the question that is every human life. I don't think there's going to be any place in the Western world where you can say 40 years from now, maybe in some places even 20 years from now, I am Orthodox, I am Catholic, because my grandmother was born in Warsaw or Dublin or Lviv or wherever. That just isn't going to happen. That's over. And that's an opportunity to rediscover what the church is essentially for, which is the proclamation of the gospel and the invitation to people to enter into friendship with Jesus Christ, and through him with the Holy Trinity. So that's what I see coming a part of this, and that's no bad thing. That's no bad thing.
Even before the Maidan, the statistical surveys would prove that the church and generally religious organizations enjoy the trust from the society more than president, government, police, army, and the parliament all put together. And this is a unique feature of the present-day Ukrainian context. And the big question mark is how we are to bridge this gap, between what you say ecclesiology, the self-perception of the church, and civil society, society at large. What does that mean, and specifically in Ukrainian context? Will the churches, Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, be able to use that credit from the society in a constructive way? And what might be the steps that needs to be taken by religious communities in Ukraine to make this happen? Because can you imagine this, harmonious coexistence of, I would say, secular and sacred in present-day Western European context? It's just unimaginable. We have a unique window of opportunity in Ukraine to present the world something new, a new mode of coexistence between religious and sacred, between society and the church. And it's still a challenge for Ukrainian religious communities how to use this credit and trust from the society in a constructive way. And your question between the relationship between ecclesiology and civil society is something that Ukrainian context needs to address as soon as possible.
My question is a little bit more direct on some of the things that how the Maidan evolved and the role of the churches. The churches were there. It started off as a peaceful protest, looked almost like Gandhi would put together perhaps. The students got beaten, I think it was November 29th that evening. Then Molotov cocktails and rocks started to fly. And I spoke to one person who was there in the Maidan, person of faith, and said, I couldn't bring myself to throw a rock at these riot police because after all, they are human beings. So I'm interested in a couple of things. You said I can't have to point to somebody, so I can point to an Orthodox, a Catholic, and a clergyman for the Jewish faith. However,
Igor is actually not a rabbi, but I'd like to see him become a rabbi.
So the question here is, did the religious communities or churches or somehow help restrain this violence? What is their view of that violence? Well, obviously was it justified? So there's a lot of different discussions, but from a church point of view, and then in the aftermath, of course, there's a war going on for the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and there's guys walking around defending the territorial integrity of Ukraine who are wearing symbols that look a lot like swastikas. So, the question here, through that, what was the role of the church, and what's the aftermath, or the various religious organizations, and where does this go from here? What is the moral guidance and to make the Maidan pure and true, I guess, as an example going forward for all of us, how to live?
The pure and true part is the part that scares me, because I don't know of any human activity that is entirely pure and true. It's going to get mixed up. Yeah, the pursuit of virtue is what we're talking about, right? But there are going to be various people who get involved in anything that is that big. You're going to have various people. You can't control everything. Yes, the churches were there telling people, don't be afraid, because, God is with us. Don't be afraid. There's enough of us. Don't be afraid. But don't be afraid also, meaning you don't have to resort to this. The other thing I want to remind us is that, you used to talk about the picture of Gandhi, and Gandhi got beat up a lot of times. Okay? Nonviolent protest often does turn bloody.
No, but his question is, okay, he got beat up, but he never threw stones back.
Okay, yeah, but some of his people sometimes did. You can't always control everybody, because human beings are passionate beings, and that's a there's some collateral damage that goes on, and like you can't control everybody in a situation where you have the armed forces of Ukraine having no resources. Yes, in that vacuum, sometimes some people who are less than savory might take up the cause of defending the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And is that all of Ukraine's fault? No. Right, so the churches, I think, have been and will continue to say, and this is a challenge for all the churches, to continue to say, no, there are principles that need to be kept. And in the defense of Ukrainian territorial integrity and freedom, we cannot allow ourselves to descend into responding to brute force with brute force. We can't cluster bomb Donetsk because they started it. That's not a Christian perspective. And I think we need to hear a little bit more of that from the churches, because we heard plenty criticizing violence on the part of the government when it was against the Maidan. We're not hearing quite as much in criticism of the government when the government acts as it thinks it needs to act against the terrorist forces.
May I put this, and I just want to pick up on nuances that Taras is expressing. Because by the way, I'm not suggesting that throwing rocks back is bad, but what I am suggesting, or Molotov cocktails, but what I am suggesting is that you're going to get a spectrum of views among sincere, intelligent Christians who are going to disagree about the response. And that's what I'd like to hear, especially those of you who are from Ukraine. The reason I'm saying this, Brian and I watched the Babylon 13 documentary, which unfortunately had to be filmed only from the side of the protesters, okay? And Brian's daughter, 14-year-old, she was in tears. She couldn't understand that the good guys were the people throwing the Molotov cocktails, because that's all you saw, okay? Why am I saying that? Not because I don't believe that there's a proper place for resistance, but because so many people that I know who are sincere, intelligent Christians are going to say, well, maybe a line was crossed. And I'm interested in the debate among Ukrainians about it, because, of course, the Moscow Patriarchate was able to claim, well, we've got the moral high ground. We don't want Kiev turned into rubble, etc. We're telling everybody, just lay low, get off the streets, because this is what's going to happen if you continue throwing Molotov cocktails. I'm throwing this out as a devil's advocate, but you can see that there's, I think, some legit, because it raises the whole question of the just revolution theory. There's a just war theory, but just revolt, just revolution is still very much up in the air. So anyway, whoever wants to.
If I may react to this. I think Maidan was really, and is still, a challenge to everything that we have accustomed to. It is a challenge to the Ukrainian society, to the Ukrainian churches, to the EU, to the US, to the Obama administration, to everything, including theology. I think it is a huge challenge to the established theology. After the World War II, we have developed a non-violence theology, which has become really an important tradition, if you wish, an identity of the Christian church. It was not the case before the World War II, largely. And people, if people say 60 years ago were to face the same dilemmas that we face, they would be in a much easier position, because they didn't have this kind of heritage of the Yoder-style non-violence theology. And I don't want to say that we need to revise. We need to go to the kind of post-peace or post-non-violence theology. No, not the case. Non-violence theology is extremely important. it reflects some very profound insights of Christianity that we have realized after the World War II. The thing is, what we should do with this, facing the challenge of the Maidan. Should we just throw this theology as a Molotov cocktail, throw out? Should we just stick to that and be blind to just causes of Maidan? I don't have an answer, no answer. But I think it is a huge challenge now to theology, to reconsider, if you wish, all this non-violent stuff in a new way, not to throw it out, but to really rethink it and, well, to update it, to make it more reliable to our life.
My question goes back, is kind of related to this conversation. I'm just wondering what you think about, because like you, Father, I'm not exactly opposed to just resistance, but I was wondering, based on precepts like the one set in the Mexican revolutions and stuff, do you think it would be fair to say that in an act of just resistance by the faithful, since we're talking about religion, clergy shouldn't really take a part in stuff like the throwing of the Molotov cocktails or the, riotous actions, or do you think that?
Well, there were no priests who were actually, engaged in.
I think there was.
There were some.
Sometimes I think the clergy should be thrown.
I think that the clergy was in the middle between the guns and allowing
Precisely. And actually telling both sides to pull it, yes. Sorry,
I think that the clergy were on both sides and in the midst.
Yeah, they were in the middle.
They were everywhere. Sometimes they were not dressed as clergy.
I think you're missing the question, which is, the question was kind of how, if clergy aren't taking part, how can they encourage people who are taking part to do so?
I mean, this is not, I think we're making this a bit more complicated than it is. I mean, the idea that holy orders absolves you from certain activities, or in fact restrains you from certain activities, is very, very old. We have chaplains in the armed forces of democracies, but they're non-combatants. And I think that's the model that makes some sense here. As to the prior question, one of the first functions of any just state is the protection of its citizens. When the little green guys come in, you don't, and they start shooting, you just can't put a daisy down all the rifle barrels. That's a prescription for more mayhem. And you try to do that in a proportionate and discriminate way, that resistance. But the state has an obligation to protect its citizens. Now, I think the present Ukrainian state is in a very, very difficult position because overwhelming force is threatening to be applied. It has no means of response. I think it is criminally irresponsible of Western governments not to provide so-called lethal defensive weapons. I'm thinking specifically of anti-tank stuff and whatnot. But I don't think there's any great moral dilemma about that. Or if there is, I'm singularly immune to feeling it. But I do think those who are ordained to a ministry that is intended to embody unity cannot be directly involved in partisan politics, because that's a countersign to the nature of the ministry, of the ordination, and can't be involved in the grubbier parts of defense. But they certainly can be involved as chaplain, as counselor, as, if necessary, shield. And I think we saw some of that on Maidan.
Can I just throw something in here? I was thinking about...
No, he's from Ukraine.
Yeah, okay. But this is a really messy situation.
He's from New Jersey.
Which which I have had to carry that burden all my life, and now let me. Okay. This is a very messy situation, right? When I think of messy situations, I think of Metropolitan Andrey Sheptytsky. Okay? Talk about messy situations. There's no army that is interested in protecting the Ukrainian people, his flock. Okay? One of the most misunderstood things that he did was he gave his blessing to the creation of the division.
That's the big debate in Ukraine, whether he did or didn't. Kukielewicz says yes, other people from Ukraine said impossible.
Okay, but I think it is quite understandable in the light of everything that he did throughout his life, is he wanted to see some kind of order. And what he feared most was chaos. Now, you take a situation like the Maidan, where everything there seems to be like extreme order on the government side and chaos on the Maidan side, right? In fact, we, looking back, can see that the real chaos was on the government side, and the real order and the prudence and the restraint was on the side of the protesters. But it took, to see through that muddle takes, it's easy for us in hindsight, but at the moment to see what is true, who is on the side of order that will preserve life and maintain human dignity, and what will destroy more human life and trample more on human dignity, and that's the question, isn't it? So that's what makes things juster or unjust, is what's going to bring that result. And, in World War II, Metropolitan Andrey Sheptytsky wanted for there to be net less chaos, because he was afraid that that chaos would unleash horrible human reactions and vengeance and all kinds of things. So he wanted to see some kind of resolution of these things. Today we look at this situation and we say, God, you can't just have chaos. There has to be some measure to things. There has to be some kind of order to things, because if left to their own devices, we're not romanticists who think that democracy is going to just happen. Left to their own devices, human beings can do terrible things to other human beings.
And to muddle the waters even more, in 45, Slipe tells the UPA, he officially issues letters to the UPA saying, lay down your arms. That's something. Talking about confusion, ambiguity, kind of making it up as you're going along. But this is how nasty and muddied it really gets. Because there's no doubt about that. We have the documents on that. The Sheptytsky and the creation of the Divizia is debated, but Slipe's insistence that UPA lay down its arms is incontrovertible. The documents are all there, which I'm not saying I would have supported him. So, Father Roman, and then Igor.
Since we started the historical perspective, I'd just like to remind ourselves that this non-violent approach is in fact the very fabric of Ukrainian identity and the model of sanctity. It's astonishing that the first saints that were canonized from the time of the Kievan Rus were exactly Borys and Lviv, and we call them strastoterpci. Those two, Borys and Lviv opted not to resist to their brother who killed them, claiming the throne. So Borys and Lviv were the first canonized Slavic saints. So this is somehow the very fabric of Ukrainian identity and the model of sanctity. So,
But you know the phrase, saints are to be admired, but not necessarily imitated.
that's true. That's true. So,
Admirandi sed non imitandi. Anyway, sorry, Igor, you had a...
Here I'm a representative of national minority. No, I hope here, yeah. And her question, no Christian question. Can we say about universal lessons of Maidan and Ukraine for un-Christian civilizations? For example, for modern Arabian Islamic civilization. It's a question for us. And silent. What would be your answer?
Yes, why don't you answer, Rabbi?
It's only Jewish tradition to
Answer
So we are really minority.
I see.
Dr. Ostapchuk, respond to that, perhaps?
Yes,
Well,
please.
I'm not a representative of Islamic civilization. I'm not a representative of Islamic civilization. No, I do wonder when I look at what happened in the Maidan in Ukraine and the Maidan in Egypt, and the pitfalls that I think the Ukrainian society was lucky because it perhaps is much less complicated of a society. If you look at Turkey, for example, and the whole Gezi Park movement, you have a really truly split society. Not maybe half and half, but certainly there was this sort of secular liberal society, and then there was a traditional Islamic countryside, basically, and there's no way that one side could win. I think Ukraine is not quite so unlucky, actually, because it is sort of very much a good versus evil situation. I think the forces of darkness are maybe stronger in some sense, thanks to outside help. There really isn't such a fundamental split, even in the Donbass.
And I don't know if everyone still wants to, you had your hand up before, but anyway, okay, so we're moving on. So Brian and then Father Brody.
Yeah, my question is for Dr. Ostapchuk and for Rabbi Igor. He's not Rabbi.
No,
sorry.
I'm not doing that. I want to see him ordained. Is Dr. Shchupak.
I'm part of a new initiative at St. Paul University, a Center for Abrahamic Studies and Interfaith Activities. And we recently had an interfaith prayer for peace in Ukraine on Parliament Hill, organized by the Canadian parliamentary interns. They wanted to have a prayer for Ukraine, and they wanted to involve people from Ottawa. And they had a Crimean Tatar intern who offered a prayer, and we invited a rabbi, we had Orthodox, Catholic. And it was the first time I'd been involved in that kind of thing, and I helped draft the program. And I grew up as a Baptist, so I grew up with a model of the other as someone with whom you want to share the gospel of Jesus Christ, right? That I grew up in a family of missionaries, hearing stories about missionaries, always thinking in terms of mission. And at this stage of my life, and the kind of things that have been brought into my life, such as this, and hearing your discussion today about what brings people together at Maidan, my question is the following. Do you think, especially from a Jewish and speak, I know you're not representing the Muslim community, but to the extent that you know it from your professional work, do you think stressing the moral convergences is the way that is something that Orthodox and Catholic Christians should invest more in, as opposed to trying to reach doctrinal convergence, even with one another? Never mind communicatio in sacris. When I hear Metropolitan or other people like this saying, well, we don't really interested in intercommunion with the West, that's never going to happen, or that's not going to happen anytime soon, but if we can work on the moral issues. I wonder if even if Orthodox and Catholics, at least many Orthodox, seem to think that communion is not going to happen, and doctrinal convergence, is it even more the case with Jews and Muslims that where we should expend efforts is in this peace building around common moral values and leave aside the doctrinal systems that may attach to that, or ritual systems that may attach to us in our communities.
What is a communism? It's sort of a moral compromise, even kind of moral relevance, or become the doctrinal things become really go to the background, And I mean, Ukrainian situation between Muslims and Christians is right now people are reaching the same boat, so it's very easy. I mean, for these situations, easy to come together, to converge. But I don't know if there's a real answer for you.
I think after Maidan and the conditions of real war, we live in the stress situation. In this situation, from one hand, we can see unation of different chapters of society, of different representatives of different religion, and etc. But really, we are different. We have different, maybe interests, the same its values. And later, after stress, after beginning of regular life, we need to construct new cooperation on the basis of the same values. It's my point.
Given that Jesus' vision is an eschatological vision, I'd like to hear some reflection on how that eschatological vision fits into the dilemmas that Christians face in the public square. Only because Christendom tends to make the eschatological vision wane and put it someplace out only in the future, rather than living with the tension that we find in the Christian scriptures of a vision that is both now and is yet to be realized.
Last April, the Wall Street Journal asked me to write an op-ed piece for the canonization of John Paul II, and having written 2 volumes of biography and 1,800 pages and 200 pages of endnotes and whatnot, what can I say that I haven't said before? And when I thought about that, actually something came into my mind that I think responds to your question. And that was that this was such a radically converted Christian disciple who lived in the truth of the resurrection, which changes everything. It changes history, it changes the cosmos, it changes everything. That he could resist what I called in this article the tyranny of the possible. The tyranny of the possible. He could see possibilities where other people only saw obstacles. He could see around walls or over walls where people only saw walls. He refused to be constrained by the tyranny of the possible, as the world defines possible. And I think for Christians, that comes from the eschatological dimension of the faith. We are not bound to the tyranny of the possible, because the possible has been exploded on Easter Sunday. I commend to you a spectacular book on the Acts of the Apostles by a Duke University scholar, Caven Rowe, called World Upside Down. Or Tom Wright's commentaries on St. Paul. I mean, all of this comes back to the world-shattering, imagination-shattering experience of the risen Lord and how that changes everything. Now, the trick is don't submit to the tyranny of the possible, but live the virtue of prudence. I mean, none of this is simple. But I think that's where the eschatology cuts in. It helps us not to resign ourselves to the way things are, is simply the way things have to be. And I think that was evident on the Maidan for 6 months to great effect.
Thank you so much. with that, we have to finish, unfortunately, just 3 announcements. First, don't forget about the brief memorial service followed by Great Vespers down at Trinity College. Don't forget about the evaluation form. We would greatly appreciate you filling this out and just leaving it here at the front before we thank our presenters. Annette and Tom, are you out there? Annette Hivna, our volunteer, never to be replaced until they have a lot of children. Annette, are you there? Annette and Subdeacon Tom. And with that wave of enthusiasm, a sincere profound thank you to our presenters. All of you, please take a bow.